Welcome to Allan Reports TV. I'm your host, Allan Labucan from allanberryreports.com. Today we have a new installment of our week in review. It's kind of a week in review of the last 2 weeks. We had a last minute invite to do a TV interview last week on BNN, which is Business News Network up here in Canada. So we had to preempt last week's week in review until this week. So we'll kind of do a week in review of the last couple weeks. But before we get started, I just wanted to do our usual thank yous. We use youtube.com and ustream.tv to produce and broadcast these shows and have them for you to watch at your leisure. And we have two channels, our links are up there, and that'll take you to our channels on those two websites where you can find our work. And anybody interested in doing online shows, we highly recommend them. In addition, if you're watching the show on our website at allanberryreports.com, you'll notice to the left and to the right of me that there's banners. Those banner sponsors are really important in us being able to bring these shows to you. And so if you wanted to do some homework on those companies, just click on their banners. That'll take you to their websites where you can do a bunch of homework. They got plenty of information on there. And then, of course, to you, the viewers, if you didn't show up, we wouldn't have a reason to do this show. So thank you very much for tuning in. And we'll get right to the show now. As I mentioned earlier, we had to skip last week's show due to the BNN Business News Network interview on TV. If you want to watch that show and you're watching this show on our website, just look below me in the video player and you'll notice that there's a text area there. We use that as our update area. Whenever we're doing a show or a public speaking engagement, we put links there. And if you look for that November 19th, 2010 update, you'll find the link to the show that we did on BNN. In that show, we talked about some big picture situations with gold and uranium. And we talked about a few companies as well. So we invite you to take a look at that show. Since our last show, which was on our last week in review show, which was November the 12th, I believe I got my right. Yeah, that's correct. We had about 4 or 5 new shows out. We did an In the News show on November 16th where we talked about U.S. gold and Nevada copper. The link to that is on the website. Then on November 17th, we did a show and talked about Peregrine Diamonds and Queenston Mining. Then on November the 18th, we did a show and talked about Candente Copper and Lakeshore Gold. Then we did on November 19th our BNN TV interview, and you can find that link in on the website there. And then earlier this week, we did a show on November 23rd on Osisko Mining and Rubicon Minerals. And then a couple days ago, we did a show on Capstone Mining and Frontier Gold. So in those shows, we talked about diamonds, we talked about copper, gold, uranium, and some silver in there, I believe, as well. So a really good mix of companies there for you to do some homework on. And so then after, wanted to talk about a couple of major themes. Whenever we're seeing fluctuations in commodity prices or in the companies that we follow, we try to then reevaluate and look at, well, what's the big picture? And there's a couple key themes that we've sort of talked a lot about in our past email newsletters. By the way, the best way to keep up on what we're doing is to subscribe to our email newsletter. We send out updates whenever we have a report or whenever we're doing a public speaking engagement or doing our video shows. And there's no charge to be on the email subscription. And so just fill out the information, and then that's the best way to keep up on what we're working on. But getting back to the past 5 years since we started, 5+ years since we started doing our email newsletter, there's been a couple key themes that I wanted to talk about today, and I think that these key themes are important relating to the fluctuations that we see in the markets for commodities and resource stocks. One of those is we talk a lot about long-term supply and demand trends, and the reason is that often I think that when it comes to commodities and resource stocks, there's a lot of pundits that I see, commentators talk about in media, whether that's television or print. I see a lot of talk about what's happening with the demand side. And yes, there's plenty of reasons why people buy commodities, gold in particular. You got inflation risks and currency concerns and political risks and a plethora of reasons why these experts talk about where the demand is coming from. And this also plays out into the base metals as well, with copper or into oil as well. You got these long-term demand trends coming from emerging economies. But regardless of the reasons that people are buying these commodities, if the supply was as strong as the demand, then the price of the commodities would go nowhere. In the last 10 years, we've seen a strong bull market for many commodities, the ones that we follow. And the reason for that is not only do you have strong demand, but you have weak supply. So, and that is something we always keep focused on, what's happening on the supply side. If you, the real answer for that is long-term underinvestment in the supply chain to find new deposits and to bring new deposits into production. If what's happened during the 1980s and 1990s, when everybody was really focused on, the investing dollar was focused on the next tech stock to invest in, there was not enough money, not nearly enough money went into the mining sector or the oil sector to look for those new deposits to bring into production. And so doing that over a couple decade period is why the supply chain was weakened as we moved into the 2000s. Now, as we got into the 2000s, there was a strong demand coming from emerging economies that, combined with the demand coming from developed economies, that demand overall was overwhelming the supply chain. Now, into the 2000s, things have improved when it comes to exploration and new development, but I believe strongly that it's still, relative to the demand growth, we're still underinvesting, and let alone trying to fix the problems of the past. We're not even preparing for the future. And so whenever I see these fluctuations in prices for commodities, I never get worried because I'm always so focused on what's happening with supply chain. As long as that supply chain stays in a weakened condition and you have these demand drivers, this is going to push the price of commodities higher. Now, when it comes to the other key theme that I've talked about, so I'm going to wrap this up later and sort of give you an idea of what we see happening in the short term and long term. We think that everything is very strong. This long-term bull markets for commodities is in very strong shape based on long-term supply and demand fundamentals, and nothing has changed in that regard for us, regardless of any fluctuations you'll see in prices. Now, the other key theme that we've talked a lot about in the past was the mergers and acquisitions in the resource stock space. And the first sort of big moves that we saw happening, and we talked a lot about in our past reports, you'll have to go back, and if you look above me, you'll find all of our past reports, and in there you can see how what we were talking about, and I'm sort of summarizing here, but you can find all those details in our past reports, and that those are above me in the report section on our website. So We talked a lot about the first wave was the mergers and acquisitions amongst the biggest companies in the resource space. We saw a lot of the largest cap companies taking over other very large cap companies. Then we predicted that the next move would be moving down the food chain, where the middle tier companies would start getting taken over, and even into the small caps would start to get the smaller exploration companies would start getting taken over, the ones that had made important discoveries. And so that started to happen. And during that period, there wasn't a lot of middle-sized companies to take over to start with, and then they really hollowed out that, so there's hardly any now. And then they started to move down the food chain and start to take over the junior exploration companies. Now, in our past reports, our focus has been on the small to middle tier have been the companies that we've featured in our reports. We've been very fortunate that we've had some of our companies taken over, actually a pretty high percentage, a little over 10, almost 15% of the companies we've ever featured have been taken over at premiums. And so we were pretty good at spotting these kind of companies that major mining companies are going to get interested in, and subsequently that always also relates to investors wanting to get into as well. So we've done quite well with our takeover companies, but there's still why this is so important is that it creates for a high growth company, these junior exploration companies that have success and into the middle tier, that lack of middle tier is really important, because you need that these middle tier companies develop the deposits that are not big enough for the biggest cap companies. They're great deposits for a company that wants to grow aggressively. In fact, most of the major mining companies grew to the size they are today from these smaller projects that are high growth for a small company that wants to grow into a big company. And so we're really keeping our eye closely on that, because we've got companies that are in that middle tier category in our reports, and we have companies that we think could move into that middle tier category. So we watch this space very closely, and we think that those trends of takeovers of juniors and middle tier will continue, and we think we've got some good candidates in our reports. And so now I just wanted to wrap it up and sort of talk about what we're seeing happen in the short term. Looking ahead over the next 2-3 months, I think we're going to come into an end of the year rally for many commodities and resource stocks. And I think you're going to see things finish off the year quite bullishly, and that will carry over into the next year. Long term, I talked about our long-term trends before. Nothing has changed in the long-term trends. So, we're thinking that we're going to see a rally in the long-term bull market, a short-term rally in the long-term bull market. That's still in very solid shape. So that's a wrap on our a couple weeks in review show. But before closing, we'd like to stress that this show and our reports are for information purposes only. We aren't making buying or selling recommendations. It's important for you to do your own homework and research and speak with your financial advisors before making any investment decisions. We're always trying to grow our audience, and any effort you make to let your friends know about our shows and how to find them, our website, our reports, we'd really appreciate that. We also really appreciate you taking the time to watch these shows. We know that everybody is very busy these days, and we strive to produce a show that saves you time and brings you helpful, high-quality information. Our next show is going to be an In the News show early next week. Again, subscribe to our reports and you can find out when those shows are out. We hope you can join us for our future shows and watch our past shows. And you can find all of our work on our reports on our website at allanberryreports.com. We look forward to seeing you soon. Have a great day.